known of why this lecture was named for what it has. It really is an honor to be here today. Thank you. So I'm currently the JITMM Fund, Global Health Innovative Technology Fund. This is a new public-private partnership coming out of Japan to fund global health. Fund global health research, particularly in terms of new drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines for diseases about which all of you conduct research on. All of our investments, regardless if it's for malaria, tuberculosis, if it's for schistosomiasis, lymphatic filariasis, they all have to be international partnerships. International partnerships between a Japanese entity and a non-Japanese entity, which means our success is really dependent on the work of all of you. If any of you are doing research in terms of advancing a new drug candidate, a new vaccine candidate, a new diagnostic, for an infectious disease like malaria, tuberculosis, or one of the neglected tropical diseases, you're more than welcome to apply for our funding. And we'd be more than happy to review and hopefully fund that partnership. Today I'll be discussing about the drivers, diversity, and determination, the three key words for this conference. I'll be doing that in the context of how the JITMM Fund was created, why being the driver, looking at various options and solutions for diversity, and then making sure that JITMM is a success. And we're a very young organization. We've only been in existence for 2 years. But I think it is that sense of determination that really allows us to push forward in terms of making an impact and a difference. Before I discuss in terms of the drivers, the diversity and determination, I wanted to take a step back and look at the role between infectious disease and social economic development. The reason why this is so important is because for any type of public-private partnership, the decision makers that decide to fund that partnership are typically on the government side, policymakers. On the corporate side, they're going to be decision makers and execs at the C-level, CEO, the CEO, the CFO. But then we need to take a look at that as an actual investment. They're not just handing out. It needs to be an actual investment. So for the government, an actual investment means future social and economic development. For a company, it means possible future markets and ways that they can benefit from that investment. So let's take a step back, and what I'd like to do first is look at the history of Japan in terms of the relationship, the correlation between infectious disease and social economic development. So beginning in the 1930s, many of the infectious diseases that plague much of the developing world today were very rampant throughout Japan. You're looking at tuberculosis being the #1 killer. In fact, there was over 250,000 deaths per year because of tuberculosis in Japan. Enormous stigma related to the disease. Entire villages, regions, basically being shut out of the national crown of Japan because of tuberculosis. This continued on into the 1940s. In fact, the #1 national policy in terms of health going into the war for Japan was to try to prevent and control tuberculosis. If you go into the 1940s, you're looking at once the war is over and the soldiers came back. At that point, you're looking at the highest rates of prevalence for malaria. Over 400,000 soldiers came back with malaria. These are not all the soldiers, they're just the soldiers with malaria. But then, towards the end, once the war was over, and towards the end of the 1940s, progress started. This is not only in terms of infectious disease, but in terms of political philosophy, obviously, as well. But then you see a paradigm shift in Japan in terms of looking at how to control and prevent controlling infectious disease for obvious reasons. But it does highlight the necessity of new innovations, new therapies, new medicines, new vaccines, and that problem continues today, as we heard just recently in terms of resistance problems. Schistosomiasis, other therapeutics came to prevent and control tuberculosis. So towards the 1950s, we're looking at even a continued problem. And even in the 1950s, we're looking at diseases like tuberculosis, like schistosomiasis, like soil-transmitted illness. In the 1950s in Japan, soil-transmitted illness were endemic in much as 70% of the population. 70% of the population in Japan in the 1950s was infected with this soil-transmitted illness. So through these national efforts, you're looking at Japan stepping up, and by the 1960s, it's finally become a national priority to really eliminate many of these infectious diseases. In 1961, Japan eliminates malaria. This was just actually 3 years before they held the first Olympic Games. Just 3 years before they held Tokyo Olympics in Japan, malaria was eradicated. And then it began much of the parasitic plague. For instance, soil-transmitted illness, schistosomiasis, lymphatic filariasis. These are all national efforts that took place in Japan in the 1960s that allowed the country to really eliminate many of these infectious diseases. And those same programs are the basis of mass drug administration today. The idea of mass drug administration actually came out of these national efforts in Japan. And by the 1970s, we're looking at Japan stepping up in terms of more innovative practices. Professor Omura of Sato University actually was the discoverer of what is today called mechanism, or ivermectin. Ivermectin, as you well know, is a drug that was actually the first drug related to WHO to eliminate and try to help eliminate tuberculosis. But through the 1970s, it finally came, that determination came through in terms of realizing its eradication and elimination efforts. In 1977, not that long ago, it was finally documented that Japan eradicated schistosomiasis. 1978, again, lymphatic filariasis. This is not that long ago. In 1980, we finally did global elimination of smallpox. And then you're looking at more global effort going forward. But if you really look at the correlation between infectious disease and social economic development, it is really inlaid down the history of Japanese history. This is just looking at the correlation, or rather the inverse correlation between real GDP, real GDP, and the prevalence of soil-transmitted illness in Japan. Clearly an inverse correlation. Again, if you look at it in the case of malaria, you see a similar type of inverse correlation. So there's definitely this inverse correlation between the prevalence of infectious disease and a country's ability to grow and develop social and economic. This is the story that policymakers are interested in. This is the story that corporate executives are interested in. This is the reason to invest in all of your research. And all the science that's covered over the next 3 days, this is the real reason to invest in. And this is why our fund was created. It was precisely do that, to make an investment in infectious disease on a global scale, so that more innovation was coming out of Japan, from more international partnerships, possibly new drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics, can be pushed forward and developed, so that more countries around the world can experience this type of inverse correlation. So with that, Let's begin in terms of drivers, diversity, and determination. So in my case, our story is in terms of driving forward innovation for infectious disease. Simply put, new medicines, vaccines, diagnostics for tuberculosis, malaria, and many neglected tropical diseases. So what are the drivers to our story? Well, as I was just speaking with Alan, he's a runner as well, and it seems that we have this in common. In Japan, where I live, in Tokyo, this is a park that I often run. If any of you have been in Japan, it's called Yoyogi Park. It's kind of the central park, similar to New York, of Japan. Last summer, it began this. The park is currently shut down. No longer. It's the first time in Japan in 70 years that dengue fever has presented. In 70 years. This is an exemplification in terms of really the trend in terms of infectious disease. Unless we have the right innovations, a vaccine, therapeutic, a good early stage, low cost diagnostic, then you're looking at an actual potential reverse in our success of infectious disease on a global scale for 40 years. If you look at dengue, and I apologize, this is so small, but over the last 50 years, in the 1950s, dengue only was endemic in 5 countries. Today, over 100 countries. In terms of a number of people who are at risk of dengue, almost half our world's population. And over the last 30 years, you're looking at a 30-fold increase in terms of the prevalence of dengue. This is what we're dealing with unless we have those right innovations to control and prevent such infectious disease. So why is this? Well, one is human mobility. If we look at the correlation between human travel, or the number of flights internationally, and that of the prevalence of dengue on a worldwide basis, this is the correlation. So one is human mobility, and it's obvious. We've seen this recently with the Ebola endemic as well. And recently in the park in Tokyo, we've seen that with the dengue fever. It's a human mobility that's spreading many of these infectious diseases. But also it's urbanization. I think there's a great correlation between human mobility and urbanization. When people begin to work in an urban environment, in global markets, they have to travel. And so there's that correlation between human mobility and urbanization. In 2007, it's the first time in human history in which there's more people worldwide living in cities than in countryside. If we look at it on a more granular basis, it's actually beginning from 5 years now, models suggest that the majority of people living in cities will be actually in the less developed regions of the world. The developing countries of the world will have the largest cities and the largest populations globally. Even further, if we look, the majority of the world's population is currently in Asia and will continue to be in Asia. So what does this mean? This means that going forward, the majority of our global population will be in cities, primarily in Asia, which means the risk of infection and the risk for infectious disease is primarily in those epicenters throughout Asia. That in itself is both a public health and a biosecurity risk. It's worth the investment from governments, from corporations, to drive forward new innovation for infectious disease. So dengue, as we know, is one of the neglected tropical diseases. I'm speaking to the choir here. You are most more knowledgeable in this area of science, of front So there's 17 that the WHO has defined. In terms of looking at what's the prevalence, what's the burden, it's almost half of our world population. 3 billion people are at risk of disease. 1 billion are infected. Other diseases that we deal with are HIV, malaria, tuberculosis. Overall, you're looking at 43% of our world population being at risk for these infectious diseases. So what does that mean? It means that a potential market, if this were actually a profitable market, a potential market is almost half of our world population. Half of the world is at risk of the diseases that you all deal with day in and day out. But how much innovation from the private sector alone is coming out for these diseases? Well, between 2000 and 2011, it was nearly 1%. 1% of the chemical entities that came out of the private sector from neglected tropical diseases and other diseases. About 1%. Which really highlights the need. The need to correct a market failure. You look at the trend in terms of new chemical entities, it's coming down and down. In terms of market share as well, it's coming down and down. It's simply not profitable, simply not sustainable for a private sector alone to drive forward the discovery and development of drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics. It, in a sense, is a market failure, and this is our driver. We have the onset of disease. We have large prevalences and enormous risk for infectious disease on a global scale, but we don't have investment. And without investment, you don't have R&D, you don't have product development, and thus, you don't have new innovations coming out. This is our driver. So how do we correct this market failure? Which just brings us to our next topic, and that is possible solutions. So if the driver here is a market failure, if the driver here is trying to bring in more innovations for infectious disease, what are the possible solutions? Well, I like to always think about it as kind of a door. Behind the door, you have all this innovation. So there's 2 ways to open the door. You can pull it, and you can push it. So this was me actually when I was little, but but you can pull it and you can push it. So let's first pull it. If we pull it from the consumer side and create a kind of a quasi-market, this is what entities like the Global Fund and Gavi do. In a sense, by pulling innovation, they're creating that market. And by creating that market, more companies are willing to possibly invest in this. The other is to push it. And that's where we go. We come in to try and invest. And by investing, R&D, continued product development, and then the service development. So in terms of diversity of solutions, in my perspective, we're basically as an investment entity to try to push forward more research, more development, for new drugs and vaccines. We're clearly a public-private partnership. And why I'm stressing this is typically, right now, you hear public-private partnerships throughout the world. They're usually about 90% public, and maybe some in-kind donations or whatnot from the private sector. We're absolutely 50%. And that's really key because if you look at even the willingness of these companies to advocate for this, the willingness of these companies to bring on other companies, the willingness of these companies to become a commercial partner in a drug that's going into phase 2 or phase 3, that's really where the value added is. So I wanted to go over the incentives of both public and private. Because this probably does that to why we pick this solution, why we pick this amongst all the diverse possible solutions out there. For the Japanese government, last year, they announced the first ever diplomatic policy for global health. This is one of the pillars of the JITMM. They have to become engaged in global issues. Global health for pharmaceutical companies is the global issue. And for the Gates Foundation, they're looking at trying to access the enormous potential of drug discovery and development in Japan for global health. If you look at the capacity for new drug development in Japan, it's actually number 3 in the world. Number 1, the US, number 2, Swiss, and number 3, Japan. This is often not very well known. And the reason being is because Japan doesn't have a big GSK or Pfizer or Merck. The largest company in Japan is probably Takeda. But there's actually over 200 pharmaceutical companies in Japan, over 50 medical device companies in Japan. And this is really the potential, this is really the capacities and capabilities that we're trying to access out of Japan. And then tie them up with international entities like yourself, international researchers, international scientists, international organizations, regardless if you're based in Geneva or if you're based in Bangkok. This is our role, is to try to facilitate that bridge between Japan and outside of Japan, so these international partnerships can drive forward innovation for global health. This simply is our model. We gather the funds, we distribute the funds to these international partnerships, and we're trying to drive forward access to all of our products, our potential products going forward. So anything that we're investing in has to have a no gains, no loss policy for endemic populations. Has to have a royalty-free license for the endemic populations. So we're trying to improve access to any of the new products that possibly come through our pipeline. The last is determination. So with that model, how determined are we in trying to drive forward these new innovations? Well, we've only been in existence for a year and a half. Very young. It's all about how much we can create an impact going forward. Now that we have the model, now that we have the policies aligned, now that we have the governance, blah, 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 that's really not what we're all about. We're all about trying to facilitate and trying to fund really good science and research. To date, over the last year and a half, we have funded over 30 partnerships. Over 35 million have gone out the door. And we suspect this will continue to increase in the years to come. Our last request for proposal was aligned with the London Declaration for Neglect and Tropical Diseases. We'll be announcing that set of new investments in January and February. And in our next request for proposal, which will once again include neglect and tropical diseases, malaria, and tuberculosis, will be announced in January or February. We want this to continue to go up. Amongst those 30 partnerships, this is, again, a little difficult to look at, but as you can see, it's spanning anywhere from discovery to clinical research. Each and every event, any one of these is going to be an international partnership. In terms of drug development, all the screening programs, ticket to lead programs, preclinical programs, they're all for new chemical entities. Each and every one of our investments are for new chemical entities. Which means even though the drug is going to be developed for malaria or for tuberculosis, possibly it can have additional indications going forward if it's successful in phase 1 and phase 2 trials. But you may have noticed that we don't call ourselves a foundation. We call ourselves a fund. Because our funders and we ourselves look at this as an investment. Investment in the future growth of social economic development. That's why we're here. We drive forward innovation so that more people throughout the world are healthy, join the workforce, and prosper. That's ultimately what we're doing. And that is an investment. No, we don't actually claim return or fiscal return on any of our business. Our return is that impact. Our return is actually getting products out the door. So how are we assessing ourselves in terms of getting products out the door? How much are we actually driving forward product development? Well, recently we announced these 3 different types of metrics to assess ourselves. How do we want to be assessed as a fund? How do we want to be assessed in terms of driving forward product development? We've done this through 3 very clear, concise product metrics. One is product development milestones, the next is product development stage gates, and the last is invested in innovation. So in terms of product development milestones and stage gates, we're simply using the lexicon of language in terms of driving forward potential candidate drug or vaccine. We've laid these out. What we define as milestones are more on project management, small steps throughout the process. In terms of stage gates, those are more key decision points in terms of additional investment going forward or not going forward. So in terms of milestones to date, this is how we're generating this. And we're still early. Given the fact that we're only a year and a half in, many of the investments in our portfolio have yet to fail. And given it's R&D, many of these will fail. Many of these will fail. But it's our imperative to push these forward until you can see, are they going to fail or not going to fail? Is it a go or is it a no-go? We just don't want to fund just for science itself. We're funding the product development and to drive forward new innovations for infectious disease. In terms of stage gates, this is how we're assessing. And invested innovations. These are simply potential products. So any of the screening platforms, any of the screening compound libraries, we don't assess these at all. We don't count these. We only count potential product or invested innovation as we say. Once it's defined as a candidate, a drug candidate, or a vaccine candidate, or a diagnostic candidate. If it has 2 indications, we count that to 2. So these are potential products. And right now in our portfolio, amongst those 30, we've identified 16 potential candidates for new products for these infectious diseases. So I've been asked to speak for it now, and it's not my intention at all to speak for it now. So we've gone over drivers, we've gone over diversity, and we've gone over determination. An example of that, in my personal case, is going to be the JITMM fund. And given the contextual, given the ecosystem aspects of how the reduction and the reducing of infectious disease can drive forward social economic development, this was a key message to our funders. In terms of defining the drivers, so what is the problem? Why can't innovation, why can't the private sector alone drive forward new drugs and vaccines and diagnostics for infectious disease? Once we define those drivers, that problem, we looked at diversity. What can we add to it? We don't want to become another global fund or another guy. We want to push forward. We want to be a pushing mechanism so that we can actually contribute more Japanese innovation and technology to global health through via the international partnerships, each and every one of those. And then in our determination, we're looking at this as an investment and not just a grant. We're trying to assess ourselves, and we're trying to really, really push product development forward for infectious disease, thus solve
Thank you very much, Dr. B.T. Slingsby, for your May I also invite Professor Day and Associate Professor Prabha on the stage, and also Professor Aruni.